Hi, and welcome back to Police Stories Podcast. This is episode 17, and I'm Dave, and this is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force, covering various things that I've done throughout my career. Hopefully, you found it interesting so far. If you've listened to any of the previous stories, and if this is your first time, well, hopefully, it'll inspire you to listen to some more. So, today we're going to talk about public order, which is disturbances, can be large fights or riots at the sort of very upper end of it. This incident we'll talk about today, as well as a bit of background about public order, is probably the closest thing I came to a riot. I'm sure some people that have been in what I would call, proper riots would laugh at this one, but this is the closest I got. So public order is the guys and girls that you see on the telly with all the big, they're called NATO helmets with the visors and the big pads on their legs and arms, and the shields. That's public order in the UK police force. That's what it's called. And there's various levels of that. And most cops at the beginning of their career are trained in the very basic level of it. And then you can go on to do further training to get the sort of upper levels. And if you're on a full-time team, then you'll be level one, which is the sort of highest in this country. And that's trained in everything, and it does incorporate a number of things as well as the sort of policing of demos that could get out of hand for various reasons. Um, I mean, the history of this is that back in the sort of 80s, there was things in the UK and London like the Brixton riots, and really there was no sort of provision made for cops in that scenario. They basically had their top hats on, their custodians, the traditional sort of British bobbies, helmet, and that was it. They improvised at the time, and also we saw that on some of the footage at the miners' strike as well, which is also in the 80s. And basically cops were picking up dustbin lids at the time, metal round dustbin lids that had a handle on top, and they were using them effectively almost like sort of Roman centurions to ward off bricks that were raining down on them. And other than that, and their helmet, if they had it on, that was all they had for protection. So there was a lot of injuries, and it probably started before that, but certainly in earnest, I think public order was looked at then in terms of training, excuse me, and kit, that they would have. Some of the things we saw at those previous riots that again tip this over is, petrol bombs being thrown. At the time, there was very little protection from that at all. We would also see, certainly in the miners' strikes, things like nails that were nailed through the front of kind of steel toe cap boots. And then police officers were kind of kicked in the legs with these boots with the nails through. So there were some fairly bad injuries through that. Um, there was all sorts of improvised weapons and things used against cops, as well as pretty much everything. And nowadays, we quite often see cobbled streets or walls that are nearby or anything broken down and broken up enough that creates rubble that you can basically throw at the police. So something kind of needed to happen in terms of the training and the kit. So there's three types of shield. There's what's called a short shield, which is this really a bit like the dustbin lids, but plastic, So it's a round shield that looks like a kind of Roman centurion, covers, the upper part of your body. Really effective. The great thing about a short shield is that it's very easy to move around with. It's lightweight, you can be mobile. And because it's got a couple of sort of hoops on the back, metal hoops that you put your arms through, you're able to still grab hold of people and have use of both your hands, but the shield stays with you. It's not going to get sort of taken off you and taken back in the crowd. Quite good at deflecting missiles and things, but when I say missiles, I mean rocks as opposed to something fired from a warship. But the problem is you have to see them coming. You have to be looking to the sky, and as the missiles come over, you're effectively moving your arm up with your round shield on to deflect those missiles. It's not like it's just going to protect you willy nilly if you don't see it coming. Then you move on to like the intermediate shield. This is what a lot of forces use. They're kind of 3/4 height. So if you held them up against your chest, they might come up to the bottom of your chin and maybe halfway down your thigh on the sort of average person. So it gives you a lot more protection and a decent width as well. Again, covers you width wise. The other thing those shields had the ability to do was lock together. You could basically lock them together with the person standing next to you shield, and they could do the same, and you could actually form, again going back to kind of Roman shield tactics. You could lock all these shields together, and it gave you a really good protection, that was locked together, so it was solid. You could also put sort of overhead protection, again, exactly like you see in sort of Roman times from arrows. So you'd have this line of locked together shields above your head, and you'd have some in front of you, and you could move forward as a unit. I mean, you really were a target then, but obviously you had the protection, so you could sort of take a certain amount of incoming, rocks and bricks and etc. petrol bombs. And then finally, you have the fall shield. Not many forces use these. Well, certainly didn't in my time. They're very cumbersome. They're really heavy, and basically, sort of a 6 foot person standing up, they'll come to the top of your head, and also they'll be resting on the ground at that point. They're full height, so great for protection, but not very mobile, very heavy. Difficult to run with. That was part of the kind of physical fitness test to get into the public order. You had to be able to run with an intermediate shield, in fairness, not a full shield, but a certain distance. And that was based certainly locally on the fact that there'd been an assistance shout once where the public order guys had to run, I think it was like half a mile with a shield, and then still deal with the big disturbance the other end. So that was sort of part of the training, which was fair enough because that was actually based on, a live job. So yeah, there was definitely a sort of an upper level of fitness required for the public order. And in terms of the kit, nowadays you have the NATO that we've already talked about, which is the big helmet with a visor that comes down the front. It's also got a neck guard. You probably have got, and it varies in forces again, but you've probably got arm guards, shin guards. The guys will have a cricket box on, as well as your normal body armor. So you're reasonably well protected, but places that are vulnerable are, say, kind of your thighs can be. Although again, I've seen lots of forces with sort of thigh protectors too. I never actually had those, but thighs can be vulnerable, and so can the tops of shoulders. Although some forces I see have issued, kind of shoulder protection. It looks a bit like kind of the American football armor, that goes over your shoulders. So different kit. And the good thing is the overalls you wear are now all flame retardant, and obviously that's vital if you're having petrol bombs thrown at you during the training. Again, you'll go through, that's one of the things that happens. You're taught how to deal with it, and then you all line up, and basically the instructors throw petrol bombs at your feet that kind of explode at your feet and cover you in petrol and effectively set you alight. But you are relying very much on the kit, that it is flame retardant, and generally it is. You kind of stamp your feet. You'll have a friend standing nearby with a small fire extinguisher, but generally stamping your feet is kind of enough to put it out, and the fact that this flame retardant stuff, you can't set it alight. But quite a scary thing the first time you do it. Certainly during the training as well, you practice lots of the tactics, and we've already talked about kind of the Roman tactics, and definitely some of them are. So you'll practice moving with your shields, connecting the shields together, overhead protection, and then eventually it moves on to basically the course gets split in half. Half of the course plays the rioters, which of course is always great fun. And basically they'll have a collection of, when I did the training, it was like wooden bricks. So they were still pretty heavy. You wouldn't want to get hit with one, but they weren't obviously full-size bricks, because if you do get hit with one of those, you're talking almost guaranteed injuries. So yeah, these when you're lined up and the first time you're taking fire, if you like, from bricks, wooden bricks, they come sailing through the air, and initially you don't take it too seriously. Like, wooden bricks, I've got a big plastic shield, it's not going to hurt that much, and I'm going to stop them anyway. But the noise is quite substantial of, this flurry of sort of wooden bricks hitting the back of your shield. And actually, the odd one or two does sneak through and gets maybe on the thigh or on your shoulder. It certainly makes you tighten up behind that shield. You suddenly want to make yourself tiny and tuck in behind this shield. But it focuses the attention somewhat when you do get, one in those vulnerable places, because, it might be a relatively lightweight wooden brick, but, you still feel it and it still hurts. And that's the idea, really, because it's not going to kill you, unlikely to injure you, possibly a bruise, but it's really going to make you tighten up on those tactics. So the training's excellent. And I think when I did it, it was about a week for the sort of level 2, which is the mid-range public order. It was good fun, basically, and it was, I have to say, fairly sort of testosterone fueled. There was quite a few alpha males there. There was definitely at that point a sprinkling of females, and now it's very much come on and it's a real mix. But these were generally male or female people that were well up for getting in, kind of scraps, quite frankly, and used to enjoy it with the kit and with your friends. I hate to say it, but some of the times it was good fun, simple as that. So you also learn about cordons. And that's a question of, if you wanted to cordon off a street, for example, you could put a line of cops across it. There's various ways they can hang on to each other by using their belts. There's also things like filter cordons, which is really useful. So if you've got a line of cops and every other cop takes one step forward, now if you're trying to get a crowd to walk through you effectively, you're filtering that crowd, you're slowing them down, you're breaking them up, and it's giving you a chance to have a look at them. It's also really effective if during, the riot or the disturbance or whatever it is, you'll have something called EGT teams, evidence gathering teams, and they're the ones you see running around with cameras that will be filming the crowd, and that's for evidential purposes. But also it helps pick out ringleaders, because invariably, if a crowd of 100 people throwing things at you, you might have, half a dozen people that are kind of pulling the strings and encouraging people to, throw things and what have you. And once those people are identified, you potentially have snatch squads, half a dozen cops running into a crowd and grabbing that person out and arresting them. Alternatively, you might put on a filter cordon if it's a bit lower level, and basically as the crowds filter through you, you'll have spotters at the back that will have already identified the people you want to arrest. So as the crowd filters through and goes through and is split up by you, those ringleaders are grabbed and arrested, and it's quite a good way of sort of taking out those ringleaders, so it works quite well. You can also use vehicles as well. You'll see the riot vans, and they're equipped quite often with shields that are on the front of the van that are raised up, but you've got the ability to come down and cover the windscreen with a grill to stop, windscreens being smashed. They're also fitted with paint thinner in a special window washer, so that should you get paint thrown on the windscreen, you can press a button and rather than getting water, you get paint thinner, and therefore it just clears your windscreen, because that became quite a popular tactic until those things started to get fitted, to these vans. So there's some good kit out there. And then during this course, normally, or possibly as a separate course, you'll also be taught MOE, which is method of entry. It's basically smashing down doors to get into addresses, whether that's because of, it's a drug dealer's address, or there's a siege in there, or whatever reason you've got to sort of smash a door down. Now, again, going back old school, it used to be done with the foot, and I've certainly kicked in doors. Sometimes it can go okay. Other times you can injure yourself, look really stupid, fall flat on your face, and still not get in. Of course, you stand up, dust yourself off, try and look like, that's what you meant to happen, and carry on. But sometimes, you might have to revert to that if you had no kit with you and it was urgent. And then things moved on a little bit, again, sort of going back 20, 30 years, maybe more. They used to use sledgehammers, but they're not very effective. And the thing is, if you swing them and hit them in the wrong place, i.e. you miss the door and hit the door frame, something solid, you can injure yourself. There's some fairly bad injuries from these things. Certainly we used to wear arm guards across our forearms, because one of my friends used what's called a hoolie bar, a hooligan bar, which is like a long metal bar with a spike on the end of it, and he was spiking a window with it. He ended up with his arm carrying on through the window, and he basically cut all his forearm open, quite a nasty injury, needed a number of stitches. So then we had this kind of slash proof armor that attached over our forearms. The hoolie bars are really good as well for outward opening doors, because if you go into a briefing or if you've done a recce of an address, you're going to go and hit. The things you want to know about it are which side of the hinge is on, does the door open in or out, what's the build of the door? Is it wood? Is it UPVC? Is it plastic? Is it steel? We've seen all sorts. Sometimes people have started putting grills across door, metal grills, and locking them. Sometimes for security, because they're doing sort of criminal activity within, and other times just because perhaps the area they live in. But one way or another, we've pretty much managed to overcome all these things. So the main tools are your hoolie bar, and also your enforcer, which is the big red key, as some people call it. That's the main thing that's weighted that you can swing and hit the door with. But there's a certain way of hitting it, and there's certain things you can do to improve it. You don't have to be big and strong necessarily. It's more about technique, and that's what the course will teach you on the MOE side of things. Moving on, there's also things, we would use hydraulic frame spreaders. We used to carry like a small suitcase, and in it had a metal bar that had kind of two clamps either end that would be placed in between the door frames. You'd press a button on the hydraulic pack, which was battery fed. So it's not like you had a big long cable running back to somewhere. And it would spread the frame, it would force the frame out. So any locks that were now in the door were effectively negated, because the frame had been pushed open so far that you could pretty much just push the door open with your finger, because it had pushed the lock back out of the way, so it was no longer sort of connecting with the other side of the lock. So they were very good. And there was a smaller version of that called we called it the Rabbit, and basically it was a smaller hydraulic version that you could put in between a door or on the back of a hinge, and then you literally just pumped this hydraulic pump, a bit like a sort of pumping up a bike tire, something like that. And the same thing, really, it forced open the back end of the door, or popped the lock, because it was able to put out a huge amount of force. And the good thing about those is very, very quiet. So if you're trying to do something, slow time initially, or very sneaky and getting into an address unknown, then you might choose to use a Rabbit, because apart from popping the lock, it could be really, really quiet and you could be in without them knowing, which is vital if you've got information specific to, for example, that person is going to, flush the drugs down the toilet, or they're going to destroy the evidence in some way, or possibly if there's really good intel, they've got weapons, because obviously, ideally, you want to get up and in their bedroom, if they're in the bedroom, and stop them getting anywhere near a weapon, not give them a heads up you're coming through the door and give them a chance to pick up that bat, samurai sword, machete, firearm, whatever it is they're going for. So there's lots of good things. And then finally, and a lot more advanced, and I only really ever touched on it on some training. It came from the military. It's used more often now in firearms operations, and particularly with specialist firearms officers, which is EMOE, which is explosive method of entry. Came from the military, and there's things like you would effectively have, if you were trying to get through a window or a door, you might have a piece of plywood that's roughly cut to the shape of that door or window you want to get through. Then around that plywood, a piece of detonation cord is attached to that ply. It's run down a pole, the actual sort of firing wire, to the operator at the bottom, and he or she would simply hold up the piece of plywood flat against the window, press the button, which detonates the det cord, and that whole window would just atomize, basically. And it wouldn't harm the person inside, because it was so sort of extreme that it just, the glass was blown into tiny little bits that weren't really going to harm anyone. So it was a great way of getting in, but very impactful. It's not the sort of thing you'd use on a normal door knock, because, it's an explosion. It's got smoke, it's got flames, it's got the whole thing. So really, really big deal. As I say, you certainly wouldn't use it in a sensitive area, because you'd be accused very much of, heavy-handed policing. But it had its place, in certain things. Quite often we'd get big drug dealers or whatever making it known via friends or whatever, the police are never going to get in here. This place is like Fort Knox, Well, we just took that as a challenge. And trust me, we found all sorts of innovative ways of getting in these addresses. So we'll move on then to first two things. So I finished this training course. Brilliant, really enjoyed it. For a young person, who's up for a bit of adventure, if you like. It's a lot of running around and shouting and playing the bad guys. You also get to deal with like a violent man in a room. That's a classic. So they'll have just you in by yourself to deal with someone with, say, a baseball bat, and that'll be one of the instructors. And the violent man room, it is exactly what it says. There's no place for wallflowers or snowflakes. Once you go in that room, you'll have a shield, but this person will not hold back, and they'll have a baseball bat, and they'll be going for it, smashing, your shield to bits and trying to get you if you can, basically. But it was really just a minute of full-on sort of fighting to give you an idea of, firstly, how you could be protected, but also, I think, really just to face you with sort of real violence. Well, obviously it wasn't real violence, but it was about as close as you could get. Very few people came out of the violent man room and were like, oh yeah, that was no problems. I'd never thought for a second he was actually going to hurt me, because people did get hurt all the time. The instructors absolutely went for it. So there was some good tactics taught in there. And in fact, quite often, if you've got someone back in a police station who's really kicking off in a cell, or let's say they've had a dirty protest, so they've basically smeared their own crap all over the walls, and you have to move them to another cell, a dirty protest, you would call in public order, who would get fully kitted, possibly with a white suit on as well over top of their stuff, to save them getting covered in shite, quite frankly. And then there's this tactic for going in with shields and pinning someone against the wall and basically handcuffing them and dragging them to another cell. while that one is cleaned, and people will ask, well, why don't you just leave them there? But unfortunately, things like human rights come into play. So, duty of care, etc. You have to look after these people, even though it's very frustrating sometimes. So yeah, violent men would be, and cell sort of removal would be dealt with quite often. So we'll move on to. So I've done this train, I completed it, walked out the door, was feeling great. Had my head filled with ideas of, I was going to be into riots and all sorts going on. Well, the reality is, it isn't quite like that. Um, so on the area that I worked, there was, unfortunately, there was a laboratory, a scientific lab, basically, that was used for breeding of animals that were then used in scientific experiments. Very unpleasant business. You wouldn't have found a cop there that sort of agreed with it. But ultimately, to a degree, we have to do what we're told. So what had happened at this place was, there'd been a lot of protests over this when the sort of animal rights types found out about it, and it was getting more and more violent. It was coming to the time where they were attacking the scientists coming in and out, and members of their family and all sorts. But there was sort of daily, if not at one point, I think virtually sort of 24 hours a day, protests outside this lab. So we were drafted in, and this went on for months. I mean, I'm talking like, I can't remember the exact time, but it was probably 6 months this lasted. Um, it went on, and we were drafted in as public order because some of the crowds that were turning up were kind of, 100, 200 people, and it was getting more and more sort of violent as people were coming back and forward. Missiles were being thrown at them. Members of staff, sometimes sort of innocent people as well, were getting caught up on it. So it had a heavy sort of public order presence. So having just newly qualified in public order, myself and various colleagues were drafted in virtually every weekend on overtime. It would be your day off, and they'd be told, right, you've got 2 days off, but you're going to spend, both of them now at this place, sort of policing this demo. So um, so it's not ideal losing your days off, but obviously you're paid overtime, but it did make for a long week, no days off and then straight into the next week. But we got used to it after a while, and we were drafted in all the time. Now, like I said, you finish your training and have ideas that you're going to be involved in all this exciting stuff. The reality was, we spent sometimes 12 hours a day, with breaks in between, obviously, standing in front of these crowds, basically policing them. Now, in the main, these were not, nice crowds. They hated us because they thought that we were siding, with the laboratory, and that just wasn't the case. But unfortunately, as a cop, when you're on duty, you don't get to discuss your feelings, your views. You basically have to toe the party line. Like I say, to a degree, you'll do what you're told. So we were told, stand on there and, prevent these demonstrators from, having a sit down on the road or throwing missiles or whatever it was. That's what we did. So yeah, they were convinced that obviously we were siding with the lab. It definitely wasn't the case. So I didn't know a single cop who sort of agreed with it. And there was hundreds there. But so we spent all day. So it's quite hard work because bear in mind, you got your body armor on, you got all your pads and all that. So you got extra weight on. But we would spend all day standing in front of these crowds who would basically have various songs and chants that they would sing at us all day. And these weren't your normal protesters. This was a sort of blue rinse brigade. So you'd regularly have half a dozen sort of old women turn up with their, purple dyed hair and get wheeled out in wheelchairs in front of you, along with the rest of the crowd. And all day long, they'd sing at you, "You're evil, you're evil," and it would just go on and on and on, repetitive with drums, etc. We'd also get kind of your scum, 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 scum all day long. And it was just wearing, quite frankly. You'd stand there and you'd literally have to glaze over. It got to the point they were supplying us earplugs because, you can imagine 8 hours a day or whatever, standing in front of these people screaming at you all day long. And they'd be trying to wind you up. They'd be getting into you with, "Cool, I bet you're proud, aren't you? Does your mum know you're doing this?" And it would go on and on, but much worse than that. So at the end of the day, you'd just be battered. Sort of in terms of your ears, you've had 10 hours of people shouting and screaming at you all day long and hating on you. Basically, it was definitely quite wearing. But as I say, you would just literally glaze over. And then after a while, sort of 6 hours into it, whatever, they'd be saying, "What's the matter with you? Cheer up. It's not that bad. It'll never happen." All the rest. And you're like, yeah, come and swap places and stand here for a few hours and just get shouted at all day long. But they never kind of, when I was there, generally tipped over the edge into the point that you were going to start making arrests. So it wasn't the best introduction to public order, really. It was pretty frustrating. It wasn't at all what I thought public order was. But the reality is that's what a lot of it is. It's demos, it's policing demos. It's walking alongside demos who are banging drums and waving placards about whatever it is that they're, demonstrating against. So, yeah, it was a bit of a poor show, really. But an unpleasant task all round. No one enjoyed it. And it went on for months. But such is life. So some months later, I found myself getting put on now on a New Year's Eve. Obviously, there's a lot of trouble expected on New Year's Eve in your average, sort of UK town. There's always going to be extra cops on and probably a public order element as well, because that's the night that it's going to kick off. You're going to get your pubs explode. You're going to get big fights, and there's going to be lots of them. It won't just be 1 or 2 or 3 fights like it kind of normally is. This will be full on, lots of fights. And a great example was I was on a bus one night, in fact, my very first New Year's Eve. And we were driving around, and I'd never worked one, and all the old sweats had put into me, "Oh, you wait and see what happens, it's going to go crazy." And there was like 12 of us in the bus, and we were all up for trouble should it happen. And we're driving around, and nothing happened. It was like, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. There was nothing going until 11:30. I don't think we'd had a call, and there was something, we might have normally put out, I don't know, 6 cars. And on this night we had 12 cars out, and 2 extra buses with half a dozen or maybe a dozen sort of riot cops in as well. We were really, well ready for it, and nothing happened. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And I'm thinking they're winding up, nothing's going to happen. And at 23:59, every single unit was available and nothing was happening. At midnight, the place just exploded. Literally about 1 minute past midnight, first call came in. So-and-so pub, someone's been glassed. About 30 seconds later, such and such nightclub, someone's been stabbed. And this is how it went on. And I'm not kidding, by about 10 past midnight, all of those units I've just talked about, so all those resources were committed, go into a fight, a stabbing, a disturbance, whatever it was. It just exploded. I've never known anything like it. And that's how it went for about the next 3 or 4 hours. And it was only by about 5 in the morning that we'd finally sort of dealt with all the calls. There'd been about 20 people arrested across various sort of jobs. So it was crazy. So I was quite up for the posting I got a few months after the science lab job, which was to be formally posted to the kind of riot bus, the battle bus on a New Year's Eve. So it meant that you weren't going to go to all the, what we might think of as, the crappy calls. We were only going to the good stuff. They'd hold us back for the sort of the big stuff. And it was a big deal. You had some really good guys and girls on that van. I think there was about a dozen of us, fully kitted. We had all the shields. We had everything, NATOs. We were ready. And exactly the same thing happened. Only, bizarrely, after midnight, not a lot happened. There wasn't that flurry of calls. Very little happened. So I was like, oh, blimey, this is a bit of rubbish. I was pretty disappointed. And we actually got stood down early. We were told that we were going to be on until probably 4 in the morning. But by 2 in the morning, all the clubs had kicked out and people had gone home. The pubs were closed and that was done. There was basically nothing done. So the inspector in charge said, "Do you know what? I'm just going to let you go. You're done." So we were like, great. Well, we were great, but also I was pretty frustrated. I know a few of the other young lads were too, because we were really hoping we were going to kind of get amongst it. Well, what we didn't know was that was still to come. So typically, we go back to the nick and we all, get our kit off and change into our civilian clothes. So now we've got no kit at all, and we're basically in kind of, jeans and a t-shirt and a jacket. And somebody still had a radio on in one of their lockers, because we'd all sort of turned our radios off at that point. And suddenly, out of nowhere, big urgent assistance went up, not far from the police station. And the person who put it up was someone who was really well known and basically kind of quite a tough guy. He just didn't put out urgent assistance calls for fun. So everyone took it seriously, and we kind of looked at each other and we're like, we're off duty. We've got no kit. And we're like, we're not going to leave him. So we'll just go. So we just ran out in our sort of jeans. We each grabbed a baton. We had the metal expandable batons by then, so they're kind of, I don't know, about 12 inches long. And then you flick them out to the side and they extend to sort of a couple of feet or so. They're quite good bits of kit. So we basically grabbed a baton each, run out into the first marked car we could find, and there's about 6 of us in 2 cars, jumped in these cars and went flying up to where it was. Well, where it had happened was a cul-de-sac, so it was just a row of houses that was a little turning circle at the end, and then that was it. And there was only about half a dozen houses in there. It wasn't the best area in the town, and we knew, the place had potential. But what had happened was cops had been called out to a noisy party, which not unusual for a New Year's Eve, and invariably thought just go along and say, look, can you just turn it down a bit? We've had a few complaints, and that'd be the end of it. What they didn't realise was when they got out there, typically into this cul-de-sac where they were now trapped, that there was actually 2 parties, literally in sort of adjoining houses. And the 2 houses and households didn't like each other. So depending on who you liked was which party you went to. So you had the scenario where you had 2 houses that were effectively, against each other. And there'd already been a bit of scuffles and a few problems between them. Then the cops turn up at their door and say, look, just turn the music down a bit. They were trying to outdo each other on the volume levels for the music. But they seemed to comply initially and kind of turn it down a bit. And there was a little bit of verbal abuse for the cops, but nothing terrible. The odd sly shout and whatever, invariably from the brave one at the back. But anyway, so that was it, job done. So they leave the address, they come out of the address, and this car comes driving down the road towards them, and it's all over the road. And it basically wobbles past them and it goes onto a driveway, and obviously is intending to park on his driveway. But the driver is so drunk, he overshoots and basically drives into the side of his house. So, of course, they go running over to see if he's all right. It's very apparent that he can literally barely stand. He's so drunk. So he gets taken out of this car and arrested. Unfortunately, what happened was the 2 houses had sort of witnessed this, and they were aware. And the guy who was a drink driver lived in that close and was well known, so they realised that he was getting arrested. Of course, they weren't very happy about it. So the next thing you know, you've got this scenario where you've got this angry crowd, which initially was only about 10 people, standing around these 2 cops who've now got this drink driver in handcuffs. And they're up against the wall, literally backs against the wall of one of the houses. And they've got batons drawn, and they're literally having to sort of take swipes at people with their batons to keep them back. So they put up an urgent assistance, quite rightly. So we've grabbed our batons, we drive off to this address, and as we come round the corner, there's already a couple of other cop cars there, but they're also having similar problems. And basically the cops are hemmed into this sort of semicircle around one of the houses. By now a police dog's turned up, which is fantastic. And that also he's working the dog in like an arc around the cops to keep them, keep the crowd back and keep them safe. But they're starting to throw things now. There's the odd bottle coming over and, bits and pieces they're finding on the floor. We basically we went running down the hill. There were so many cars parked in the close now that we couldn't get down there. So we had to abandon our police car halfway up the hill. And then 6 of us run down with our batons drawn above our heads and basically kind of running down to get involved. And what happened was we went piling into the crowd, sort of pushed them back enough, and then all of us tried to withdraw back up the hill with the drink driver prisoner, the dog keeping people back and all the rest of it. But unfortunately, what happened was the crowds basically withdrew slightly so that they were out of sort of biting range of the dog and also us swiping with our batons. But then, of course, they started finding the missiles. So they started breaking up a low wall that was nearby, throwing the bricks on the floor, which then split into kind of, 4 handy-sized chunks to throw at us. So we were faced in this position that we were public order cops, and all we had was a baton, not a helmet, not a shin guard, not a box, nothing between us. We're now in this protective line in front of the cops that have nicked the guy for drink drive, and we're slowly working our way back up the hill, while all the time we're getting pelted with rocks and bottles that were smashing around us. It was quite a decent kickoff, quite frankly. And 2 hours before, we'd have been well placed to deal with it with all of our equipment. But typically, law of sod says that when these things happen, you'll basically have your thin T-shirt to protect you from the flying bricks. Needless to say, we all got out unscathed virtually. I think there was a few, cuts and bruises. Mr. Drink Driver was arrested, and the parties eventually kind of dissipated, and people went their separate ways. So it was a bit of a kind of two halves, really, of public order. The vast majority of public order is policing demos, standing there getting shouted at, spat on, and abused all day long, and not really able to do a lot about it. And then the other side is you actually get a decent disturbance. At one time there was probably 50 odd people in the crowd, I suppose, throwing things at us and what have you. As I say, there'll be people out there listening to this going, that's not a riot. Now, I was in a riot. But it was the sort of closest I came. And interestingly, technically, in the eyes of the law, to be a riot, it has to be more than 12 people. But also, if, let's say, it happens in a town centre and like the town centre gets destroyed and all the shops are smashed to bits, if the chief constable of that area says that was a riot, then they're all able to, then basically it's the police's job to pay out for the damage. So I can't tell you how many large disturbances we've had, that involved kind of 25, 50, 100 people. They were never ever declared riots, and that way the chief constable never had to pay for the damage. So there we go. So that's a little bit about public order and one of the incidents I dealt with. Hopefully you found that interesting. As I say, that was episode 17, I think. Downloads going well again this week, and as you probably know, we're on YouTube. So you can also go onto YouTube and add some comments if you want. I've also cheekily added a buy me a coffee link, so if you were liking what you heard and wanted to show your appreciation, a couple of pounds, you could buy me a coffee if you wanted to, but absolutely no pressure. It is free, and by all means come back. Don't let that put you off. So I'll speak to you again soon. Take it easy. Bye.